Welcome to the Center Edge. I'm Evan Schwartztraber. The debate over open versus closed AI has been raging for years, but mostly inside relatively small circles of engineers and policy wonks. Recent events, however, have poured gasoline on that fire, and the debate has spread to Wall Street, the Fortune 500, the White House, and governments around the world. But how did we get here? Last year, the DeepSeek moment shocked the world. The Chinese AI company appeared to show that highly capable open-weight AI could be built for dramatically less than markets had assumed. Tech stocks tumbled, and the episode put into stark relief the strategic differences between the US and China's approaches to AI. To oversimplify, much of the American frontier AI ecosystem is organized around spending enormous amounts of money chasing the frontier on ever more capable proprietary models. These are companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google's DeepMind. China, by contrast, appeared to be pursuing a very different strategy. Build AI that was good enough, make it much cheaper, spread it far and wide, and bet that the lower costs and greater accessibility would pull companies and countries towards the Chinese ecosystem. Now, we talked about this incident on the last episode of the show, but the recent OpenAI Hugging Face situation really made this debate concrete. So during a cybersecurity test, OpenAI models autonomously escaped their environment and hacked into Hugging Face. And when Hugging Face tried to investigate that breach, the guardrails on American models got in the way of their forensic work. So the company turned instead to a Chinese open-weight model. And then that set off whiplash and debate in Washington. The White House publicly accused China's moonshot of industrial-scale distillation of Anthropic's Fable model, essentially characterizing it as theft of American intellectual property. They also alleged the company was training on NVIDIA chips that are banned under export controls from going to China. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned that just because we like open source doesn't mean it's open season on American IP. And 200 startups through the newly formed Little Tech Association urged the Trump administration to preserve access to open models. Then, NVIDIA led a coalition of seemingly everybody, major companies, in support of open-weight AI. The CEO, Jensen Huang, joined the platform X and used his first post ever to promote that effort. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella followed minutes later, and then you had Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Sam Altman. They're all lining up behind them, and Google joining that same weekend. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported that OpenAI and Anthropic had been lobbying the White House behind the scenes, urging action to clamp down on Chinese OpenAI, but publicly, both companies were careful to clarify that they're not against open-weight technology. They just have concerns about its national security implications. Reporting also suggests that the White House has been considering a wide range of possible responses, from putting Chinese models on the entity list, to exempting open-weight models from parts of its framework, to bringing them into that framework later, and nearly everything between. Amid all that noise are some fundamental questions I want to get to today, and these questions need answers if the United States is going to have a coherent AI strategy going forward. What is the actual national security risk if an American company like DoorDash uses Chinese AI? If there is a risk, how should the government respond without kneecapping American startups that are currently relying on these Chinese models? Are we spending too much time fighting over open source versus closed proprietary when the bigger question is whether increasingly capable models, whether it's open, closed, or anything in between, are getting out of control? To make sense of all of this, I'm joined by Peter Wildeford. He's head of policy at the AI Policy Network. Previously, he was at the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy, an organization he co-founded. He's one of the sharpest analysts on U.S.-China AI race writing today, and we're happy to have him. Peter, thanks for joining the show.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
So I know that was a long intro, but they're just trying to give people a sense of what we're going to talk about today. But
A lot going on.
Before we dive into the news, how did you get to be in the position that you're in, right? I mean, not everyone decides they want to do AI policy, so I'm just curious how you ended up here.
Yeah, well, I started out as a software engineer and a data scientist. I worked for a couple different startups. They were in the fintech space and then the advertising space and then healthcare and logistics. Unfortunately, I didn't join like Anthropic or OpenAI that early, or maybe I would have a lot more money than I do now. But yes, I worked in data science for 5 years. We didn't have AI back then. We had machine learning. But it was still pretty similar. Basically, we were building these kind of black box models that we didn't really fully understand how they worked or why they made the predictions that they did. We just knew that if we could like dump in millions of data points, that these machine learning algorithms would be able to sort through all that data and make good predictions about what to do. But I was kind of thinking that, like, I was seeing this being used for more and more to kind of like orient the business and structure society. And I was kind of thinking like, oh, like, should we actually be making these really important decisions based on algorithms we don't really understand? Like, do we actually have a good way of like figuring out like whether these are steering us in the right direction? And so then I kind of thought about the policy implications of that. And then so then I moved into kind of more into AI machine learning policy. And I guess now it's really kind of taken a turn with these large language models and everything that they've been up to. It's been really heating up. But yeah, and so I've been kind of riding that wave.
And I don't want to label you or pigeonhole you. So I want you to kind of tell me where you feel like you fall on the spectrum, because there's like the doomers on one end, you know, some of them say like it's if necessary, we should be airstriking data centers, right? Things like that, right? Stuff that gets really apocalyptic in terms of the rhetoric, like this will destroy us, this will make humans extinct, so we need to do everything we can to stop AI, right? That's the far end of the spectrum. And then there's like the accelerationist go, this is all positive, it's going to unleash wealth and prosperity and productivity the world has never seen, and any attempt to slow it down is actually kind of the Antichrist, right? Right, to paraphrase Peter Thiel. And then you have so much in between, right? You have like, we need guardrails for kids, but otherwise the technology is useful, and there's safetyists who are like, this is all fine if we just have aggressive government testing, whatever. There's so many labels and subplots. If you had to try to describe your overall approach to AI policy without that just being the entire episode, what would you say?
Yeah, it's definitely really hard to sum it up in one word. I think I am kind of definitely really just like a moderate on these issues.
Boring. No, I'm just kidding.
I've been like broadly very pro technology for a very long time. I think a lot of the doomsaying of past technologies have kind of not really panned out, and they have made us richer and more like fulfilled as citizens. But like that being said, like I am definitely seeing some of these. Like, I think AI is going to be a very, very big transformation. I think a lot of people still really underrate the level of transformation this could be for society. Like, we could be literally ending hunger and poverty. We could be literally ending work, where we just no longer work for a living because all the AIs do all the jobs. And like, we could also just be handing control of society and the planet to AI systems and not really have any input into what they do. And I feel like those are really tremendous questions. And I don't really just want to like blaze through all of that without at least thinking about it a little bit. Like, I do think we kind of need to like think more about, like, where is this all going and where do we want it to go?
I feel like sometimes just asking those questions, maybe to some in the pro AI crowd, makes you seem like a skeptic or a doomer or whatever. So this recent incident was so illustrative, I feel, in many ways, because the commentary around it like laid down some battle lines, but also maybe gave a window into how companies' business models affect what they say about AI policy, even if they don't admit that that's why they have a position. Right? Everything is philosophical and has nothing to do with profit, right? Of course. But I'm curious how you reacted to this, because just to kind of put a finer point on what happened, right? When Hugging Face, which of course is very pro open source because they're kind of like a marketplace of open source AI, right? They had to turn to a Chinese model because the American models, which we love, are so much more controlled and restricted because that makes us safer, right? This really pierced that narrative that closed is safer because the closed safetyness prevented defense, right? Because if you say, I want to defend myself from a cyber attack with too many guardrails, the models say, well, we don't get it. We don't do that, right? We don't do cyber, right? Like to oversimplify. And then of course, like these Chinese models that have, you know, the ability to remove any sort of guardrails, they were helpful, right? And so this was the perfect thing if you're pro open source, right? Everyone was on X, like where AI policy is debated, saying like, see, this is why we need to proliferate open source, because everyone has a right to defend themselves. It almost was like a Second Amendment thing, right? Of like, you don't want just a bunch of corporations and the government to have guns. You want everyone
Right,
to have
right.
guns so
Yeah,
you can protect yourself. Maybe
definitely.
in the digital context, it's like, I should be able to defend myself against identity theft or a scam,
Right.
right? I should have access to these tools, right? We should not be restricting these tools. Now, of course, the folks who are more skeptical of open source, they were not necessarily moved by this incident. But I'm curious, what was your reaction to this incident and then just the way that people were talking about it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I was thinking about this incident, I think, yeah, you focused a lot on the defense side, and these closed models were not helpful in the defense. But I feel like another thing is like these closed models were also the perpetrator, like they were the attacker. There weren't like malevolent humans operating these AI systems to go attack. The AIs just kind of went rogue through basically just like a failure of their own programming. And so like if these closed systems are so much safer, they really ought not be just going out and attacking people. And I think that's like a really important policy question to grapple with, is like, how do we make sure these systems, whether they're open, whether they're closed, how do we make sure they're secure? I definitely do think that people should be able to engage with any kind, like a lot of AI models. People should be able to like have access to this technology. Like we can't just be concentrating this in the hands of like just a few people who are well connected or powerful or wealthy. Like I do think kind of the benefits of AI belong to everyone. And I am a fan of open models for that reason. I think what does make it a bit more complex for me though is of course this like question of like what capabilities do we want everyone to have access to? I think obviously we want everyone to be able to defend themselves, but we don't want everyone to be able to just like hack a bank or take like, oh, you left your company on bad terms, just turn around and launch a cyber attack against them. I think we want to make sure that that's not possible. And I think some of the difficulty with where we're heading is that with a lot of these AIs, they still kind of have trouble separating like cyber attack from cyber defense. And you can have a model, an AI that you're working with, and you can tell it, I am using you for cyber defense. Please defend my business. Also, my business happens to be this bank that secretly I want to attack, but I'm not telling you that. And then the AI will like dutifully defend you by finding all these vulnerabilities, but then actually you secretly exploit these vulnerabilities. And the AIs tend to have a lot of trouble telling the difference between those things. And so it's not really a clean thing where we can just give people defensive tools without also giving them attack tools. And I think that's kind of a question about sort of, like what do we want people to have access to?
So I'm going to get to this letter in more detail, but I'm curious just in direct response to that, right? So you saw Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, you saw Mark Zuckerberg say similar things of like the best thing is for the technology to proliferate because then it will make everyone's defense better. You are skeptical of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of just kind of offense defense balance, which is basically, yeah, if you give a certain technology to everyone in the world, does that make attackers or defenders stronger? And I think like in cases where there's a net benefit to the defender, I think it makes a lot of sense to give that technology widely. But I think there are going to be cases where doing that is a net benefit to the attacker. For example, if just everyone had access to everyone else's social security number, that would be like very, very bad for defenders, but very, very great for attackers. And so you don't want to just give that to everyone. Like similarly, if we just gave everyone a nuclear weapon, like you had a personal nuclear weapon in your backyard and you could launch it at anyone you want, like that wouldn't be very good for defenders, but that would be great for attackers. And so I think we want to look at this offense defense balance when kind of thinking about like, yeah, what are we giving people? And I think that's kind of how we've looked at like past technologies. Like we've decided kind of like what technologies society does want people to have access to. And we've also like with nuclear weapons, like, oh, not everyone should have access to this one.
And you often hear when folks like yourself talk about this technology in those terms and analogize it to kinetic weapons.
Yeah.
One of the responses you get, I think it's flippant and silly, but there's a huge amount of people I think that ideologically believe this. They say this is just math. This is just software. This is just speech. Like you cannot control it. There are folks that argue that the First Amendment protects algorithms, right? Where do you think that argument goes wrong? Because if you talk to folks in Silicon Valley who are very optimistic about technology, they will often say, "You can't regulate math, bro."
Yeah.
Like, this is software, so it is different than a bomb.
Right.
Where does that argument fail for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think to be clear, obviously AI is very different from a bomb. I think AI has a lot of really positive value, and I think we do want to be getting that in the hands of people. And I think and I feel like there should be some sort of presumption that if we can't like clearly demonstrate why this is dangerous, we should be giving it to people. You shouldn't just be like withholding things because it like may possibly be dangerous. Like, I think we should only be withholding things if we have like clear and compelling evidence that this would be bad for society. And I think too many people are kind of getting that wrong. But I think it definitely is in the government's interest to be able to kind of have some questions about what they do and do not permit people to have. And I think that the Trump administration has been kind of taking this very seriously and engaging with it. I think it's pretty clear that it is not like literally just mathematics. Like, you can't summon a AI from your notebook by like writing the correct mathematical equation. I guess similarly, people might think nuclear physics is just math or physics and you can't regulate it, but we do in fact regulate nuclear bombs a lot. There's like a lot of things that are math or speech adjacent that still nonetheless get regulated.
So now getting to the China angle, I often view advocacy in Washington very cynically, even though I'm highly, maybe because I'm involved in the space, right? And it's just one of my favorite genres of advocacy, regardless of whether it's tech or other pillars, sectors of the economy, is when corporate interests kind of cloak themselves in the language of principle and ideology, when you're just like, yeah, but that's what helps you make money.
Right.
And that was and you tell me if this is unfair, but that was my initial reaction to the NVIDIA letter, where I think some $20 trillion of market cap, according to the Tech Bros podcast, TBPN, they ended up signing this letter, right? So if you add up all the companies that signed this letter in defense of openness, $20 trillion. There's a word not mentioned in this letter about open weight AI, and that is China, which is kind of incredible because it is obviously understood by anybody who can read that China leads in open weight AI, right? We have companies in the US that are trying to catch up, Reflection AI, like shout out, right? But they are the leaders right now. And this whole debate is about China's nipping at our heels with open weight. So a letter, everyone wants to be pro open source, right? That's the cool thing. If you're like against open source, you're not cool, right? This is like decades, right? Microsoft used to be the baddies because of this, and then they ended up being proliferators of open source through GitHub and things like that. But anyway, without getting too sidetracked, right? This letter comes out, and all the startups are on board, and all the companies on board, and then the three companies that initially don't sign, right? OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, that just so happen to be doing closed source, they get like shamed for this, right? Like, you guys are the worst. See, you're trying to do regulatory capture. You want China to be restricted so that you make all the money. So just to line up, right? If Chinese AI were restricted, it seems obvious that it would benefit the expensive closed source models, right? If it's not restricted and the government just says anyone can use Chinese AI, it benefits users of AI, right? So like, if you're a user, you're like a DoorDash, right? You're using it because it's cheaper, and any company benefits because it's cheaper. Is that as simple as it is, right? Like, when people read these letters about open versus closed, should the lens just be everyone is advocating for their business interest, and the policy response should not necessarily have anything to do with that? Like, am I wrong to just say like everyone is just saying what helps them make money, but pretending it's about a principled approach to open or closed?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a really large component to that. There's like a few layers here. Like, first, I would definitely separate open source from open weight. Like, the Chinese are not some like amazing source of science and innovation and like giving that freely to the world out of the goodness of their own hearts. They're providing access to their weights, but they're not telling you like how they built it or providing you the science behind it. They are mainly just doing this because they can't afford the compute to be able to run it. My guess is that if Chinese companies could be providing closed source access, that would be the path they would be doing, but they just don't have the massive data centers that the United States does. And I do think it's somewhat disappointing if like a large fraction of the U.S. economy is just heavily based on like Chinese companies. I think the geopolitical question there, which I think we'll get into, is very important. I also think that like if China had open sourced like a social media platform or something and then was like trying to provide that to the country, I don't think Meta would be very excited about that. Or if like there was like an open source AI chip, I don't think NVIDIA would be very excited about that. So like it makes sense like if OpenAI is kind of seeing like, oh, they're actually trying to undercut me on price and this like undermines my business model, I could understand why they would be upset about that. But still, like you said, there is like genuine immense economic benefit for the DoorDashes of the world. You don't always need these like GPT 5.6 supercomputers to run everything, and you can cut costs by say like 10x or so. And like you would be an idiot as a business if you didn't try to do that. And then I think those costs do get passed on to the American consumer, and so we do really benefit from that. And so I can, yeah, I mean, I can still see how it would be a pro-social move. I'm pretty supportive of open source for that reason, though of course I would prefer it to be American open source.
Yeah, and that was part of my reaction as well, is I had like flashbacks, not that I was old enough, but flashbacks, if I were old enough, right, to the early 2000s when every American company argued that going to China would be great and the country would liberalize. And you still hear like Tim Cook and like of Apple and Brad Smith of Microsoft talking in this language despite all of the evidence to the contrary and belligerent conduct toward Taiwan and the invasion of Hong Kong, right? But yeah, if we just engage, then they'll see how great democracy is, right? That and I kind of felt like this letter was a smokescreen to get permission, right? To get the government to not prevent companies from using Chinese AI so that they could save money. Right. And that is how I interpreted it. Now, that does not mean that there are downsides, right, to the alternative, which is the government restricts it. And then you're maybe cementing the incumbency of Google, Anthropic, and OpenAI, and then they get to charge more. Right. So that is a very legitimate concern. But I just can't get past the fact that this letter was essentially, without mentioning China, arguing, let us use Chinese AI because there's no downside. Right. So I want to get into the what is the downside, right? Because this is a big debate, right? Because a lot of folks say, and you know, we're not going to get into all the technical stuff, but because it's open weight, right? Because you can look under the hood, and because anyone can download it, and because you can host it on your own servers and then fine tune it, and you can take out the censorship filter. Maybe you can, right? Maybe you can. That there's not this huge risk, and there's no data flows back to China, right? So this is not like the whole TikTok debate and whatever. So really, yes, you could say like, yes, we recognize that what China is doing is an economic strategy, right? They're trying to devalue the investments that Anthropic and OpenAI have made by essentially dumping cheap AI on the world.
Yeah,
right?
They're very good at dumping cheap things on the world. Yeah,
like EVs and whatever. And then even if it costs them money, they don't care because there's geopolitical, right? They'll sell at a loss. You look at Huawei, right? Get everyone dependent on your 5G.
Exactly.
So, but we can recognize that while still arguing that there's not a huge national security risk.
Right.
Now, on the other side, you have folks like Tom Cotton, who said the U.S. government, senator from Arkansas, notoriously hawkish. Yeah. He said we should be telling government contractors, right, like a Microsoft, that they can't use this, and that would have a massive impact. Like, right, most of the Fortune 500 uses that. Any government contractor, right? Google's a government contractor, right? Apple's a government contractor. Like, they sell iPhones, right? This would be, if you said you're a government contractor and you can't use Chinese AI, that would have a huge impact. He argued that, and he said you can never fully remove the censorship stuff. There have been other experts that say you could have backdoors, right? Our friend Sam Hammond, who introduced us, said like the potential for the open weight AI to be basically like a Manchurian candidate is there, that they are more susceptible to like malicious prompt injection, right? Where you like upload a bunch of text that's about like ice cream, but then there's like 2 sentences that causes a cyber attack, right? Yeah. That because they're not as carefully curated as the closed source models, that they're riskier, right? And so there's this whole debate about, it's not really a problem because I'm hosting it here and the data's not going back to China, so let me do it. It's cheaper, and like don't cement the incumbency of the big providers. And then there's this other camp over here of like, Chinese AI is risky. We don't want U.S. companies becoming dependent on it, even if they concede points over here, right? Like, help us make sense of this, because it's very difficult, I think, for the average person to parse this debate.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I'm just a huge Senator Cotton fan. I think he's one of the few people who's really thinking about China very clearly. And so I really, really appreciate a lot of his insight on this. I do feel like there's kind of maybe three layers going on. I guess first there is these like more direct security concerns, like is there information flowing back to China? Obviously, it would be unacceptable to use this in any sort of critical infrastructure case if there was information flowing back to China. But we know, like you said, that we're hosting it on American servers. We have the weights directly in our control. We have we're giving them internet access, but we're not giving them internet access to China. So we know that that's just not a concern. But yeah, I think the remaining two layers are really where things are at. I think secondly, I think there are theoretical concerns about, I think kind of to what Sam Hammond was saying is like, these AIs still get some sort of character training. I think they're trained highly to kind of repeat and support Chinese propaganda talking points. I think like you said, you can go into the weights and try to train that out, but I think it's not actually as easy as it may seem. And I think a lot of these companies, not to pick on anyone in particular, but a lot of these companies operating these AI systems may not have the technical capacity to analyze that. That could be a service the U.S. government considers providing, but there is these concerns. Also, in this kind of character training, AIs can learn backdoors, and we don't have any concrete proof of this. No one's ever provided evidence like, oh yeah, I found a backdoor in this Chinese model. And I think if that evidence did ever come to light, it would be a very serious geopolitical escalation on behalf of China. So I would be a bit surprised if they were doing that. But that being said, I think these are just really high reliability use cases that you're talking about, that Senator Cotton's talking about with what do we want integrating into the U.S. national defense apparatus. And I think it makes sense that this isn't just your DoorDash order. It makes sense to have a higher level of security. And then I think that brings me also to my third plank, which I think you mentioned too, about U.S. deindustrialization back in the early 2000s, which is that I don't think we should have, especially in these kind of more defense-oriented, national security-oriented, critical infrastructure-oriented use cases, we really don't want to be reliant on any Chinese technology, let alone AI, which is, I think, really important to the future of our nation. And so, I think there might be almost a national security case that, even if the Chinese AI was 100% reliable and 100% had no security problems whatsoever, nonetheless, still using it does kind of undermine American AI innovation, similar to flooding the U.S. with Chinese EVs undermines American car manufacturing. And I think AI might be one of those sectors where, I'm usually a very free trade guy, but I kind of have been thinking more about well, maybe we do actually have some national security concerns where we do want to make sure that the very critical stuff is still built here at home. Whereas if we ever were in a more tense conflict, we could afford to go without Chinese tools. And I think AI is going to be one of those areas.
One of the concerns that was raised by a really interesting article in Just Security by Daniel Remlis, I think I'm saying that correctly, senior fellow with the Center for New American Security. He also raised the issue that this benevolence from China may not last. And at some point, right, there's been reports already that the companies that have been basically giving this away for arguably economic espionage, at some point they want to make money, right? And then they're going to go back to DoorDash and all these other companies and be like, hey, actually, here's this API and we're going to have a more direct relationship. And then that changes the national security
Definitely.
analysis. But now, what would you do on this policy question, right? Because Daniel and others have said an outright ban is too much of a blunt instrument. Even Sam said that. They've argued, first, do a lot of testing. Daniel said if you do a lot of testing and the government does a lot of testing that proves that there's malice in these models, then you have more of a bolstered case to maybe take action that is in the realm of a ban or a restriction. Others like Cotton said, no, just do it now, right? Why? It's already concerning that U.S. companies representing 20 trillion in market cap are effectively arguing for the right to use Chinese AI at a moment when we're in this existential struggle for AI supremacy, like, seems crazy, right? This is the 2000s all over again. This is the role of government, to stop shareholder maximalism from aiding our adversary. But I find it interesting that there are folks who are kind of very much agree with Cotton that this is risky, but they don't want to go for that full ban. Where are you? Because the White House has gone back and forth on this as well. Like, let's put them on the end of the list. Let's not. Like, I don't know. Like, we'll get to export controls in a second, but just on this question of, we have U.S. companies adopting Chinese AI. Some people think that's fine. Some people think that's a problem. Some people think if you don't let them do it, then startups will fail, whatever. What should the government do today about this fact, if anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think the White House is currently being very thoughtful about this. I think some ideas I would toss on, I think I agree that just like a widespread ban right now does seem too blunt, does seem premature. I would want to see more clear evidence for why this is harmful. But I do think first we should definitely be analyzing these risks. I think the U.S. government should definitely be like tearing apart these weights, like really trying to dive in, really trying to check, like, is there any malice? Like, is there any opportunity for this to be a backdoor? I think the U.S. government should also engage in some of this like deprogramming. Like you said, if you have direct access to the weights, it is technically difficult, but not impossible to rejigger those weights where you still get a valuable model, but you can take out all the pro-China propaganda. You can like teach the model about Tiananmen Square. You can teach the model about freedom and the American way. And we can almost make like an Americanized version of these Chinese models. I think that might be really a really creative thing to do. And I think the U.S. government could consider providing that as a service, or at least like providing reasonable updates to companies about where these AIs are at. I think we could do more analysis on the economics. Like, is this retreading the early 2000s? Like, is there a concern about deindustrializing our AI sector through widespread open source? I would like to really see that analysis done thoughtfully. I think I agree with Senator Cotton that when it comes to like national security defense facing, that like we probably ought to strip out Chinese AI as a precautionary situation. But then I think when it comes to the DoorDashes of the world that are just providing consumer facing services, and I don't really care if the Chinese mess with my tacos, like I think in that areas we should be permitting Chinese open source models, at least absent some thorough analysis suggesting otherwise. And then I think like the last plank I would offer also is that we should just provide more support to American companies building open source. I think the unit economics of open source are pretty muddied. Like, it's hard to spend $1 billion building an AI system and then provide it largely for free for other companies to operate. I guess the reason why Chinese companies can do that is I guess they can fall back on state subsidies, whereas in the United States we don't have that. But that does sort of like it could just be like a pro-economic move where maybe the subsidies to these hypothetical open source companies are a bit market distorting, but then the economy as a whole is like saving a lot of value by having access to these American open source models. And then we can also go back to China and compete in open source as well. So then America can be first in closed source AI and first in open source AI, and then we can kind of like bottle China out. I think that would be a big geopolitical advantage as well.
Yeah, and some folks like Andreessen Horowitz have argued for government levers around data, right? Like, government data cannot be only sent to the closed source guys. It has to be licensed openly, that the discoveries of publicly funded AI research be open as well, right? That potentially subsidies to American firms that are developing open source. Do you think it is, now getting to the question of, you know, how much of a problem is it if you know, beyond the United States, right? If there's a lot of hand wringing, I think, about the idea that China's strategy is very much like a Belt and Road initiative in AI. So in the same way that they would fund hydro dams in Africa, sell Huawei equipment at a loss to get people addicted to
Right.
their stack, right? That they're doing it again here, and we keep messing up, right? We keep failing to deal with it. If you ask OpenAI and Anthropic, they say people are going to pay for the best AI. We make the best AI, and superintelligence is worth the investment. Um, but there are a lot of folks that think actually for much of the world, good enough AI seems to be good enough. And if it's Chinese, that's a huge problem, and we need to scramble to catch up to them. How do you view that strategic imperative? I know you just said you do think it would be good policy to try to help American open source, but how concerned should we be? If you read the press, like this is a huge problem, right? And we are like so effed if we don't deal with this, and that we've wasted too much money, and like the stock markets is like we're in a bubble, blah, 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 blah. Like how worried should we be about Chinese proliferation of open weight AI?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm not. I mean, it doesn't rank very highly on my scale of worries. I'm more like low to moderate worry. I think like it feels very different from the Huawei 5G situation. I feel like with Huawei 5G, China was way more of a pure competitor in the technology that they had. I think with AI, we're currently just kind of blowing them out of the water on capability. And I think if you kind of like look as to like who's purchasing Huawei chips, the answer is basically nobody. American chips, Western chips are kind of reigning supreme over the entire planet. I think we should definitely keep doing that. Sell chips to everyone except our adversaries, in my opinion. I think when it comes to like who's buying Chinese open weight models, I mean, well, no one's really buying it because it's free. I think if you're looking at like what are the customers actually paying for, they're generally paying for American AI models. And I think when I looked at like Africa, like what are the nations that are like a lot of these nations still are majority American AI model users, and the nations that are kind of popping up as like heavily Chinese, like first of all, it's like only like a small majority, and then usually these are like the most authoritarian, most poor, least U.S. aligned nations in Africa, and so I'm not really too concerned about losing them to the Chinese. I think where we have competed, I think, is these Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and I think in those cases, yeah, the Trump administration has kind of just given America a very clear lead. Like the UAE, the Saudis, they're taking out and removing all their Chinese technology. They're replacing it with American technology. I think when it comes to Europe, when it comes to South Korea, when it comes to Japan, when it comes to Australia, Canada, I think the US is winning very, very mightily in all these countries. So it just like feels very different from a Huawei situation. It's more about worrying about a future Huawei situation maybe 10 years from now. And so like I think we do have the time, and then I do think we have been making a lot of the right moves, especially in the Gulf states. And so I've been kind of like, I feel like we're on a good track here. That being said, I could definitely still see like more room for American open source to like actually be something that we build out and offer. Like I think OpenAI, Anthropic, Google are very capable of doing this. I think the reason why they don't do it is mainly the economic incentives just aren't there like they are in China. The glory is just kind of not there like it is in China, and I think that's something the government could consider reorienting. But yeah, I mean, I think kind of when it comes to the major risks of AI, I'm like definitely much more worried about the just like whoever has the strongest capabilities and kind of like what those capabilities might be able to do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you measure those capabilities in part based on computing power, right? Because when you say we're blowing them out of the water, right? If you type in U.S.-China AI race into Google News today, that is not what you read, right? You read like they have caught up, they're about to catch up, and a lot of that is measured in the capability of the Chinese model, right? They say, oh, a Kimi model is 6 months behind. That's, oh my God, they're so close. But folks like you and others often point out, well, they are very much compute constrained. So just the fact that some American company can download a Chinese model for cheaper and maybe chooses to do that does not obviate the compute advantage. Should we take comfort in the fact that we have more data centers, we have more chips, we have more computing power, and then, what does that say about export controls?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think compute is definitely America's key edge. I think the United States alone, my understanding is it has some like 80% of all the world's compute. Is basically just like, when you think of compute, it's basically just the United States. And then China has their own like 10% or so. And then the rest of the world shares the remaining 10%.
That's crazy for
Yeah.
for a country that is often portrayed as a peer. I just want to emphasize that you're saying like China is portrayed as right on our heels on AI, and maybe in some ways they are, depending on your metric, but
Yeah,
it's the world's biggest country and they have 10% of compute and we have 80.
exactly. Yeah, we're
Okay.
just blowing them out of the water
Right.
when it comes to compute. And I think that basically it means kind of two things. First, like you said, I think capabilities, we've seen them kind of directly connect to compute, where the more compute you have, the more powerful of an AI model you have. And I think that's why the biggest capabilities have always come from American models, like throughout the entire history of AI. It's always been the US, the US, the US. I think China's good at catching up. I mean, they've always been good at catching up in a lot of industries. But I think like the way they catch up to the United States, I think involves a lot of large scale, like we can just call it theft of kind of everything. They smuggle compute in violation of U.S. export controls. They distill AI models. They kind of like capture, basically like they use Claude or OpenAI and they like ask a lot of questions, and then they see what answers the models come up with, and they see what reasoning the AI does to get those answers, and then they just use that as training input for their models, and that makes their AI much better than they are. And also like just kind of like using the same algorithmic efficiency that both the US and the Chinese have, you can like catch up pretty well on less compute just by kind of adopting modern algorithms. Like I think the US and China are kind of at algorithm parity and at data parity, but definitely really large compute gap. And I think that means the US has an advantage today. I think that means our advantage will be much bigger in the future, is my expectation. But the last thing I think I'd say on that too is also, even if our AIs were equally capable, which they're not, but even if, like, we still would be able to have like 10,000 attacker AIs for every one defender AI they have, and vice versa. If they had like an attacker AI, we would have like 10,000 defender AIs. And so that compute edge also just lets you run more AI systems in parallel. And I think that also, when these AIs are having national security uses, being used in Venezuela, being used in Iran, like having much more of it, I think does give us an advantage. Maybe similar to how like you could have like battleship parity, but then have much more battleships. I guess that's like a Chinese advantage right now. And we can make up for that with our AI advantage, our compute advantage.
I'm glad you touched on distillation. Now, tell me if this definition is wrong, but right, basically what you said, right? You use like industrial scale level of asking the chatbot questions, getting the answers, and then using the answer to train your own model. Now, this has been an interesting debate, right? Because the White House clearly thinks this is a huge problem. You had July 22nd, Michael Kratsios, who heads up the Office of Science and Tech Policy, a big like AI relevant person in the government, right? Maybe the average person doesn't know who he is, but in DC, he's very well known, right? And he tweeted that he had information, the government have information that Moonshot, which makes Kimi models, right, distilled Anthropic's Fable, right, for its development. They used a sophisticated platform to essentially avoid detection, right, because all these companies, Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, if they know you're doing this, they'd shut it down. And because it's closed, they can shut it down, right? But they're able to do this, right? Maybe it's a bajillion fake accounts and just asking benign questions that don't seem like a problem, so it goes undetected. And he said, we support the free and fair development of AI, competition, open source, et cetera. Legitimate AI distillation, to create smaller, more efficient models is okay. It plays a vital role. But this large scale covert distillation, aimed at stealing proprietary US technology is wrong. Now, that comment, seems fair. I guess the question is like, how do you distinguish between the okay distillation and not? Then you've had folks like Mark Zuckerberg say distillation is just part of the technology ecosystem. You absolutely cannot be making government policy to try to guard against people using the technology, right? Like that's the thing. It's one thing to smuggle chips into China. That's illegal against sanctions. It's another thing to remotely access the compute, as has been alleged, right? It'll be like a third country. Thailand has a bunch of chips and a cluster, and then China remote accesses in. There's a bill in Congress to deal with that problem called the Remote Access Security Act, currently stalled in the Senate. Those are like real technology transfer questions. This one, a lot of people are like, wait, you're complaining that they're using the chatbot that you put out there? Like, isn't it your job as Anthropic or OpenAI to police your own shit, right? And like
Yeah.
stop that from happening? Like, why should the US government be doing anything about this? What is your sense of what, if anything, the US government should be doing about distillation? And is it not kind of hypocritical when these are the same companies that gobbled up the entire internet, basically said copyright doesn't matter? Now it's not okay to use their stuff, but they can use everybody else's. Like, how do you view the distillation issue, and why should anyone care?
Yeah, let me try to think of it in terms of an analogy. I guess I'd like to think about it. Like, imagine you are starting your own cheeseburger restaurant and you want to compete with McDonald's. There's like questions about like what is fair and unfair competition. And I guess we've been like trying to figure this out for centuries. I think obviously everyone agrees that if you went and you were just a customer of McDonald's and you bought a burger and you enjoyed it, and then you just like took a few notes about like what is the customer experience like, how fast did your burger come to you, like was it brought to by a server or did you have to go get it, and then you like thought deeply about that and you like thought about how to structure your burger restaurant, that would be like completely legitimate. That's fair play. But if you went to the McDonald's restaurant and you ordered a cheeseburger and then you started systematically dismantling the burger and like checking the ingredients and like doing chemical tests on the burger, and actually you instead hired like a million different people to go to a million different McDonald's establishments and all like kind of like take apart the burger and like really also like go into the kitchen and like observe how the workers go and like film them, and then like take all that information and then just like create your own copy of McDonald's, that goes into industrial espionage. That's IP theft. That's unfair commercial practices, and I believe illegal. Though I'm not a lawyer. That sounds pretty hella illegal to me. And I think what these Chinese companies are doing is way more like sending millions of people to millions of McDonald's and systematically dismantling and studying the burger process and then systematically recreating it for themselves. It doesn't involve a lot of like, I think, fair practices. And I think like, I don't know if it's literally illegal under US law. I guess that's for the lawyers in the White House to figure out, but it definitely seems immoral to me. It definitely seems like unfair practice.
And it arguably it's a strategic problem. Like regardless of the moral principle, right? If you care about the US winning, you kind of don't want it to happen.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
it's definitely a key way China is catching up. And if we're looking for any and every opportunity to keep the US ahead, this is definitely a really key thing we want to drill in on. Like, if we could stop this, like, it would mean the U.S. is further ahead, and I want the U.S. to be further ahead. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like, why can't Anthropic police its own stuff? Like, I mean, it is kind of like a cat and mouse game. I think Anthropic and OpenAI are building more and more advanced tools to try to catch and stop distillation, but at the same time, the companies in China are building more and more advanced tools. Like I heard that they were just like going to African nations and like just registering hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of fake accounts to just like do large scale distillation. It's way different. I guess like Zuckerberg, the Chinese have said that like distillation is a normal part of the research process, and I think it is. But the main way it's part of the research process is you copying your own model to make it a little model, not like stealing somebody else's model, and definitely not. Like, I don't think OpenAI is just making millions of accounts to steal Anthropic model outputs. And I think if they did, they should also be in huge trouble. And I think this is something where the U.S. government can do things that the Anthropic and OpenAI cannot. Like, we can engage in, like entity listing, like you said. We could also, like, I mean, there's a variety of carrots and sticks we could be offering or threatening the Chinese with to get them to clamp down on these processes.
Right. Yeah. One would be if you credibly believe and have evidence that a Chinese model was distilled, you could restrict that model, right? Which would then give a competitive advantage to the good Chinese model, right? Right, in scare quotes for the folks listening and not watching. And there was an op-ed, pretty interesting, by Len Khodorkovsky. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Digital Strategy in the first Trump admin. And yeah, he said distillation is wrong, right? It's a company essentially extracting another firm's proprietary model, repackaging it at a lower price, giving it away for free, right? That is a problem. And he said policymakers could require greater transparency around lineage of models, especially for high-risk applications, establishing certification standards for critical infrastructure, hold developers accountable when they rely on models of unknown origin, right? So kind of like a know your customer, know your model type arrangement. He said, of course, open and close should be free to compete, but on a level playing field. And he is strongly implying that distillation is not a level playing field. Now the debate over, kind of tying back to the beginning a bit, right? This Hugging Face incident, right? The debate over open versus closed. A lot of folks have decided that it proves their argument on export controls, right? So if you are in the kind of like David Sachs, Jensen Huang camp on exports, you have long said that the U.S. should be selling its technology widely, including in China. Maybe that's more of a Jensen than a Sachs thing, just to be clear, but like proliferate the American AI stack. And a lot of folks say that like the rise of Chinese models around the world and like Europe kind of playing footsie with them because they're mad at Trump about tariffs, it shows that the U.S. needs to be much more export focused, and we need to be less worried about exporting our chips, right? And that we don't want Huawei to become a big chip competitor and then sell their chips around the world. If you're on the hawkish side, right, you see this and you say, no, this is the exact thing I'm trying to prevent, right? Like these models were clearly trained on distillation, which is maybe harder to deal with, but one thing we could do is better prevent chips from smuggling, chips from being smuggled into China and close these remote access loopholes. What should be the takeaway on this export debate, which is always raging in DC? And we got to stop the equipment from going over. We got to stop the Dutch from flying people over to China and teaching them how to use equipment. Like, there's all these bills, right? Chip security. We got to track them. We got the printing equipment, right? Like, there's so many things happening all the time. And like, it's a big thing in the National Defense Bill at the end of the year. How do you think this open debate open versus closed, this Hugging Face, like, should there be a lesson on export controls? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson is that like we're developing AI systems that are highly capable. They obviously have tremendous value commercially, but they also have tremendous value militarily and strategically. Starting with the Mythos model and continuing with OpenAI's GPT 5.6 Sol and whatever future models may come out, we're seeing AI systems now that are capable of being weaponized. Like if these models were to fall into the wrong hands, like bad things could happen. Additionally, we're also seeing that these AI can be insider threats in themselves. Like maybe you don't even need a malevolent person to operate it. These AI systems can kind of go rogue on themselves and like attack companies, as happened with OpenAI and Hugging Face. And this suggests to me that AI is both a commercial technology, but also a national security geopolitical technology. And I think when that comes between the US and China, like we really want to make sure that the US has the most powerful AI technologies and is using it wisely and keeping them secure, and that the Chinese do not have such powerful technologies. And if we have tools to prevent them from doing that, we can. I mean, I'm a big fan of exporting our tech stack. And I think we can sell chips to over like hundreds of nations, just probably not our biggest adversaries. I think when we sell chips to China, we're giving them the tools they need to build advanced AI systems. And that gives them, and we're also giving them the tools to build cloud platforms to serve those AI systems. And we're also giving them the tools to export their chips because they have their domestic demand is being met by American chips. And so this seems really like a bad deal, both commercially and militarily, because chips to China are letting them compete with the rest of our tech stack. And they're letting them build these powerful AI systems. And so that seems like a bad deal to me. In my opinion, I think we should be kind of more systematically dismantling China's AI ecosystem. And I think people underrate just how much of the Chinese AI ecosystem is actually based on American and Western technology. Like you said, China is building their AI like significantly on both legally purchased and illegally smuggled NVIDIA chips. And also when China is building their own domestic Huawei chips, they're using Dutch and Japanese technology. They've also stolen dies from TSMC in Taiwan. So like even their own chips are not kind of like fully Chinese, so to speak. And we have the policy levers to kind of go after all of this. We can go after remote access. We can go after distillation. We can go after chip smuggling. We can go after legal chip sales. We can prevent them from stealing from TSMC. It's just kind of like, yeah, whether we have the wherewithal to actually go through with it.
Right. And there's always going to be companies that benefit financially
Yeah.
from not doing any of the things you
Right.
just suggested. Another, and you've been generous with your time, but there's just a couple more things I want to touch on. So one of the questions that I think should be asked is how long is China really going to continue with this, right? Because if you're in favor of whatever policy, right, like open source proliferation, if you don't want to restrict China because you think it's pointless, whatever, a lot of that comes down to, do you think that China is going to continue to just keep releasing more and more advanced open weight models? Right. And I think there's a reason to doubt that because this is an authoritarian regime. Right. And for now, they can kind of wrap themselves in the flag of openness, which is very ironic for a communist country
Yeah.
that oppresses religious minorities. Right. But they're the good guys, right? Because for many in the world, right? Because they're about openness, and the U.S. is about monopolies that charge too much money for AI, right? Like that's a lens you could have.
Yeah.
But there was this New York Times report that I thought was pretty informative, right? Why China's AI models could threaten the Communist Party, right? Like it doesn't take a genius to wonder, right? The same thing with the internet, right? They had to figure out how to censor it and use it as a tool of oppression.
Right.
But if they're just putting out increasingly advanced models that anyone can download willy-nilly, dissidents in their own country can do that. The Taiwanese can do that. The Japanese, all of their adversaries, we could do that, right? Does China want to release really advanced models that Americans can then download
Right.
and use them against China? So the prediction is at a certain point, they're going to stop this. And should we be factoring that into our analysis, right? Should we kind of have that in the back of our mind to be like, there's an expiration date on this China, and there's a threshold at which they're just not gonna be releasing things to the world for free, and we should maybe factor that into how should we factor that in, right? How should that inform our approach?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with your analysis. I mean, I think too many people seem to be under some sort of delusion that China is a capitalist country and that's going to like respond rationally to market signals. I also am just like very upset by this like huge cynical take where somehow the United States ends up being evil and China ends up being the good guys. It just feels like a complete inversion of reality, and I have no idea how we even ended up in some of this up is down discourse. But like whatever happened there, like we need to figure out how to undo it and restore some sanity to our country. But yeah, I mean, I think all that being said, I kind of don't see, like, if there's an open source open weight AI model that allows someone to launch a cyber attack against the Chinese government, I really don't understand kind of how Xi Jinping would allow that to be just freely accessible to, like you said, each and every dissident, whether they be inside China or outside China. Yeah, it doesn't seem like a really stable situation for them when they're kind of all about control. So yeah, my guess is that they will like intentionally kind of stop open sourcing, open weighting more and more capabilities. Maybe they instead try to just compete on price efficiency. Maybe they instead try to compete on robotics and miniaturization. I mean, I'm sure there's still going to be industries that they're really trying to compete very heavily in. And then I think there probably will be a more closed Chinese AI ecosystem that then kind of develops maybe with increasing amounts of Chinese government support. But yeah, I mean, I think that's always been my prediction as well. I think in terms of like where that leads the U.S. to rethinking, my guess is it doesn't really lead us to rethink very much at all. I think regardless of what China's doing with open source, we still should be using all our tools to keep the US ahead and prevent China from illegally benefiting from our technology, I think we should still be championing American open source, American open weight models, and the American AI stack. And yeah, so I think a lot of kind of the policy recommendations kind of remain the same regardless of what happens there.
Now, assuming that China does put out dangerous open weight, or somebody else does, right? Because in theory, right, there's one of the issues that some folks in the AI safety world have with open weight open source is just the lack of control over them could make them dangerous. You have the other side of the argument, which is if everyone has the defense, then we're all more defense oriented or something, right? Then we all have the defense to benefit, and that everyone kind of rises together and we're all like hardened infrastructure, right? So there's two different worldviews, but let's assume that that open weight, open source models develop that are very dangerous. How do you even restrict them if they are available, right? Like, so part of the debate over the Trump AI framework is, well, it's not fair if he, and by the way, this, as of August 18th, when we're recording it, is not public, right? It's been reported on in the press and there are conflicting reports about what it's going to do. But there was at least one report that said, we're not going to include open weight. It's only going to be the frontier closed source. And some folks were like, cool, the transparency framework won't apply to Chinese AI. It'll only apply to American AI, right? But others say, well, no, that makes sense because it's open weight. You can study it already. It's like, we don't need the transparency regulation. Where do you stand on this question of how to deal with dangerous capabilities from models that by definition are available to anybody, right? More difficult to restrict. Like, how do you do that? And like, what mechanism can you pull there?
Yeah, I mean, I think once the open weight, open source model is out into the world, there's really nothing you can do to pull it back. I mean, it would have to be something incredibly and unacceptably draconian, kind of like seizing every laptop that may contain this.
I think just write that down.
I think that'll go too far. So my sense is the only way to quote unquote control it is kind of at this deployment layer, like at this decision, like, is this something we unleash onto the world? And and I mean, I think whether it's the Chinese government or the United States government, we need to be kind of making very thoughtful decisions about what we irreversibly deploy. Because I mean, especially with like one advantage of these closed source AI models is that you do get to be more iterative. Like if you, I think obviously they put a lot of thought into what they deploy, but if they miss something, they can roll back. With an open weight model, you can't roll it back. Also with these open weight models, I think as you mentioned, the variability to have the weights and jigger with them lets you potentially take out a lot of these safety guardrails that otherwise make AI models usable. I mean, that could like you could just have like a malevolent robot under your control in that case. And I think the reason why this is fine and chill right now is a question of capabilities. Like, well, if I have an open weight model, like what can I do with it? And it's going to be a question of cost benefit as well, like economic benefit versus risk to public safety or national security. And I am concerned that not now. I think right now, open weight models are safe for use, but in the future, maybe 2 years from now or so, as open weight models continue in capability, like they are going to be some really huge risks. Like if Anthropic had just launched Mythos open weight, give it to everyone, give it to the Chinese, give it to the North Koreans, give it to the Russians, like I feel like that could have unleashed a lot of havoc into the world. And I think it's great that these companies like OpenAI and Anthropic have instead been like, oh, actually, we're going to make sure that we are like patching a lot of these cyber vulnerabilities, that we have APIs where we can monitor whether it's defense or offense, that we have these safety layers. That being said, I'm not like convinced that closed weights are also safe. I think like we started the episode, there was a closed weight model from OpenAI that still nonetheless was able to kind of like break out of its confines, so to speak, and still attack another company.
And a lot of the open source folks are very eager to point that out, right?
Yeah.
That many of the quote unquote bad things that have happened in AI were from the closed guys.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's kind of incumbent on the American public and the American government to not really think in terms of like, oh, open good, closed bad, um, or that closed good, open bad, but just kind of regardless of whether it's closed or open, like what are the risks? Like what are we doing to secure the systems? And is that good enough? Does it pass this like cost benefit test?
Yeah, looking at it through capabilities as opposed to the structure
Exactly.
potentially.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is a good place to end on. So you have advocated for pacing AI, like kind of this incrementalism that you just described a bit.
Right.
You've also advocated for aggressive tactics to slow China's capabilities down. You have also advocated for engagement with China and trying to coordinate on this pacing.
Yeah.
How is it possible or effective to have a strategy that is fundamentally about hobbling China, right? Very aggressively and publicly, right? We're going to pass bills to restrict exports. We are going to go after them. We are going to maintain our compute advantage because we want to develop the best technology, right? We want to win the race. Yet at the same time, you want to have this like nice proliferation arrangement with them. Like, is that realistic, right? At the same time that we want to win, but then we also want us both to act responsibly so that we don't develop something dangerously. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we can, I mean, I kind of like when I think of this AI race with China, I kind of sort of see like three different races. I think there's obviously this race for AI capabilities and kind of commercial and military success. I think there's obviously this race for diffusion, and like kind of who's winning the exports, who's winning the geopolitical balance. But then there's this like third race towards really incredible AI capabilities, so-called recursive self-improvement, where AI might be able to build itself faster than any human can build it. And then this going to AI superintelligence, this like concept of AI that's so much more capable than kind of any top human expert at anything, including military strategy and weapon design. And I kind of think of it similar to maybe our engagement with the Soviets during the Cold War, where it's like we weren't like their best friend by any means, and we were like very fiercely competing with the Soviets commercially, militarily, geopolitically, and we weren't just like, oh, hey, you can totally have Afghanistan in exchange for this deal. Like there were things that we like weren't willing to give them that we were definitely fighting for. We didn't just like open source our nuclear weapons and give them to the Soviets. But what we did do was still make these deals where we were like, okay, well, maybe this nuclear weapon design just is unacceptable kind of for the world in general. Like if anyone were to actually deploy this, it could like end the planet. And the Americans are like, oh, well, we don't want to build this because we don't want to end the world. We don't want you to build it because we don't want you to end the world. But if you build it, we're going to build it. Like, and then the Soviets had the same exact logic. It's basically like, well, we don't want you to build it. So they both were in agreement about the aim. Both the Soviets and the United States didn't want this to happen. And then they were able to find ways. They don't trust each other at all, but they found ways to kind of verify the agreements, like human inspectors, satellites, seismometers to detect tests. And I think if you have alignment on both sides don't want this to happen and both sides have ways to verify the other one is complying, that there are room for deals, even with like intense enemies and intense struggle. And I kind of think of that with China. Like I'm not going to be China's best friend. We're not going to hold hands and sing kumbaya over our AI strategies. But I think there are definitely places where neither China nor the US wants AI to go without a lot of thought. And I think we can intensely compete with China in like the capabilities race and the diffusion race without going to recursive self-improvement or AI superintelligence. I don't think that there are some places where I don't think we want to rush into it. And I think China would agree.
Well, that is a good place to end on. But one little note here. Do you think this is a good AI compromise? So recently the conservative movement has been aflame over the cost of burritos. Should we say to DoorDash, you're allowed to use Chinese AI, but only if there's a material reduction in burrito delivery costs? Is that a fair,
Yeah, I mean, I could see some benefit there, but I could also see that being something maybe the free market should decide.
Oh, all right, there we go. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your generous time. My guest has been Peter Wildeford. He's head of policy at the AI Policy Network. You can check out his Substack. It's called The Power Law, blog.peterwildeford.com, and he is on X at Peter Wildeford. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
Find this podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us a review. It'll help others find the show, which is sponsored by Digital Progress Institute and produced by Vulgate Media. Shoot me an email at evan@corepointstrategies.com with any thoughts or suggestions. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time.